EMP Series Revolution, Episode 12. Nancy Wallace stepped out of the old Chevy pickup. She turned to her husband Henry and said, "I'll just be a few minutes. I only need a couple things at the trading post. I'll meet you back here in about 20 minutes." Henry said, "If I get done loading first, I'll drive over and pick you up." She smiled and nodded. She removed their two small children from the truck and walked off. Henry and Nancy lived on a small homestead just north of town. She made jams and jellies and grew herbs, all of which she bartered for goods at the trading post. They raised pigs, which Henry butchered and sold to neighbors as well. Nancy checked in with the clerk at the post to see how much of her stuff had sold this past week. He opened the ledger and turned it around on the counter for her to see. She smiled and said, "Pretty good week, eh, Mr. McMillan?" She placed several items on the counter one by one as Leroy McMillan counted their value and recorded it in the ledger. She reached into a glass dish on the counter and removed two wrapped pieces of fudge brownie and gave one to each of the children. McMillan smiled. She asked him how much credit was left on her account. She needed sugar. He told her that she had enough for about 2 pounds of sugar. "Would you break up a 5-pound bag for me and sell me just 2 pounds, Mr. McMillan?" "Nancy, you know I trust you for the whole bag. Take it. We can settle it from next week's credits on your account. That peach jelly's selling like crazy. I know you're good for it." Nancy smiled and said, No, Mr. McMillan. You know we pay as we go. I'm not buying anything I don't have the money for. 2 pounds will be good till next week. I just need enough for the next batch of jam." "As you wish, ma'am," he replied. She looked at her watch. It was almost 11 a.m. She smiled as she thanked McMillan, gathered her children, and walked out onto the platform. The platform was busy, as it was most days at this hour. Nancy Wallace saw her husband pull the truck up in front of the diner on the street. As she started for the truck, ushering her kids in front of her, an explosion detonated in the now vacant constable's office. The plate glass windows blew out with such force it sent glass shards and pieces of wood and metal several hundred feet. The entire front of the building destroyed. Nancy was directly in front of the window when the explosion went off. Her husband Henry watched in horror as his family were thrown to the ground in front of him. He jumped out of the truck and rushed to where they lay on the platform. He rolled her over in his arms to discover that she was dead. Their two small children were screaming as he pulled their mom's body off of them. They were unharmed. Nancy had been in between them and the building when the explosion happened. She sheltered them from the flying debris and took the brunt of the concussion wave as well. Falling on them saved them from getting hit with anything, and although badly shaken up, they were unhurt. The platform was chaos. People screaming and running for cover everywhere. The building that once housed Carl's office was burning, smoke billowing from the blown-out front wall. When the chaos subsided and the smoke cleared, Nancy Wallace and one other man, who was walking by at the time of the explosion, were dead. Several others were injured. Captain Crawford assigned Lieutenant Saunders to investigate the attack, although he had already made up his mind as to who was responsible. He said to Saunders as he tasked him with the investigation, "This time Carl Fairley has gone too far. An attack on innocent people right here on Main Street in broad daylight? He must be stopped. He and his band of terrorists have to be stopped." Lieutenant Saunders paused before responding. "Sir, do you really believe Carl Fairley and his lot are responsible for this attack? It doesn't seem like his M.O. to me, sir. I think Captain Crawford interrupted him. Lieutenant, it's obvious to me, as it should be to you, that they are responsible. Who else would do this? Then he narrowed his gaze and stared right into Saunders' eyes. I am quite certain that during the course of your investigation, you will come to the same determination, Lieutenant. Maybe then we can bring these criminals to justice. I don't see how the good people of this region could continue to aid and support him after this. Lieutenant Sanders did not like the feeling that washed over him that moment. Was Crawford telling him that he was expected to reach a certain conclusion? What about the investigation? What about following the evidence to see where it leads? One of the key principles to effective investigative work is to avoid jumping to conclusions early on, to avoid narrowing your focus on one direction without objectively considering every possible theory that the evidence allows for. Captain Crawford had been doing this long enough for him to completely understand this principle. It seemed, at least to Saunders, that Crawford had already made up his mind about who was responsible. It also seemed as though he was expecting him to follow him down that rabbit hole. Then he considered a possibility that was even more unsettling. Was Crawford attempting to steer the investigation in a certain direction that supported the narrative that they were presenting? Was Crawford capable of this? He knew that Major Stillman was operating at a level of corruption that would very likely allow him to act in such a manner. Was Crawford cut from the same cloth? With Stillman gone, Lieutenant Saunders thought that the corruption was gone with him. As he considered all these things, he thought about the man who had approached him weeks ago, the same man who had recruited him to join forces with his group to expose Stillman's corruption and bring him to justice. That man was Edwin Nunez. Saunders never knew his real name. He only knew that he was now dead, the details of which were a mystery. He also remembered Nunez telling him that he believed the corruption in the Stillman command reached well above the major himself. Now he was forced to consider the possibility that Captain Crawford was part of it as well. He went to work at the crime scene, sifting through the rubble, looking for anything that might paint an accurate picture of what really happened here. Carl rode up to the remote camp where Greg was waiting. He dismounted and went into the large tent. Well, Greg, what'd you find out? Well, Carl, Greg said, nobody knows anything about it. Levi has had Hobbs and his team under surveillance since yesterday. He says they haven't left Tyler's place since they returned here from the meeting with us. Who then, if not Hobbs and his team? Greg just looked at Carl as he contemplated it. Your guess is as good as mine, Carl. In town, above the trading post in the boardroom, Ted Holmes, Captain Crawford, and several members of the command senior staff were gathered. Together, they were drafting their own document, a document that created the narrative that they alone were fabricating to fit their desired agenda. A document that would not necessarily contain truth to any certain degree.